welcome to Combat Thoughts. I'm Robbie.
I'm Lee.
And I'm Alex.
We're going to take a deeper look at culture and philosophy behind martial arts.
Yeah, Ollie, I don't know where to start really. You're the one who went on a big old trip. Start us off wherever's sort of relevant. With a lot of the combat sports guys, they're like, oh, this is when I first got into athletics or something.
Okay.
But yours is a bit different. When did you first decide or get inspired or whatever to go on a massive old trip?
Right. Well, there's a massive old trip, or there's the question of starting the martial arts and sports in general.
Oh, okay.
Where do you want me to go from?
Let's go with the martial arts in general and then feed into the...
Let's do that, yeah.
Okay, because it all kind of links in its own weird roundabout way, I guess. So I grew up in China as a kid, which you may not know. So I was exposed to kind of Kung Fu martial arts pretty early on. Mm-hmm. So when I was about 4 years old, I moved there. And I always, I watched Kung Fu movies. I'd go to the cinema, with Chinese students who'd take me out. And I don't know, for years, I had this niggling thing that basically I didn't live up to the Karate Kid opportunity. Because as a 4-year-old, I lived in China and basically never learned martial arts. Okay. I was living in my own little bubble at the time because I loved martial arts, but never did anything about it, except for just creating my own kind of martial arts. So I'd be that kid who'd run around making up moves and flying kicks, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles were really popular back then. So I don't know what it was. I never did martial arts, but I always loved the idea of doing it. And then I left China, and the moment I left, I always had this niggling thing that I didn't take advantage of, basically being that kid who, grew up in that world and could have come out and been like Bruce Lee by the end of it. So I'd always had this thing, I need to be doing something about this. It's so wasted, this story I had. So moved on, left China when I was 9, and I moved to Poland. And again, I had this niggling martial arts sort of desire. And my sister was really good at martial arts, even though I didn't really grow up with her because I lived overseas on my own. My siblings were all in boarding school. She was amazing martial arts, just a house full of trophies. And again, I still didn't really do anything about it. But at that moment in time, I don't know if you'll remember this, I guess you're roughly born. The Bodyguard came out, the movie The Bodyguard, Kevin Costner and Whitney Houston. And as being a very kind of isolated child growing up overseas, I was set that I wanted to be a bodyguard. So I was like, it's going to be a bodyguard. Yeah. And then the next stage of that was The Dragon, the Bruce Lee movie. I don't know if you remember that, came out soon afterwards. And then I wanted to be a Kung Fu bodyguard. And that was my destiny. Even though I was only 9 years old, in Poland, there was no restrictions on going to the cinema. You could just go whenever you wanted. So as a 9-year-old, I'd go to the cinema, just watch all these, whatever they were, age 18, 15 movies. So I watched The Bodyguard 2-3 times. I watched The Dragon 2-3 times. Still didn't enroll in any martial arts classes. Decided to continue creating and designing my own martial art regimes. So we used to have this country cottage in Poland. And basically I'd go there and create my little martial arts for myself. And I don't know if you remember watching that movie, but basically Bruce Lee has this pillar with all these sticks that comes out of it, and he fights.
Oh, I know the Kung Fu things, yeah.
Yeah. So I was like, right, I'm gonna create one of those. Firstly, that's the first step to creating my martial arts. And couldn't do that, so I basically just dug a hole and put a big stick in the ground. And had this little place built, which I then aptly called the Kung Fu Center as a 9-year-old. And every other weekend that I was available to go to this place, I'd go to my Kung Fu Center and start training my own specialized forms of Kung Fu that I was making up on the spot, including my little sticks, which were basically twigs, I think, but I treated them as sticks, fighting staffs. Mm-hmm. And just, went about mastering this form of Kung Fu that I had created. not knowing this entire time that I was walking about 15 minutes away from my family in the cottage, but that the back window of this cottage actually looked out directly onto my Kung Fu center. So in my entire child years, thinking I was going off and privately creating a Kung Fu school of my own, my family would just go sit at the back window and just piss themselves laughing for about half an hour, watching their 9-year-old sibling just having imaginary fights in some sort of field in the middle of nowhere. So Kung Fu continued to be this thing that I always wanted, but never quite kind of got a chance. Well, I had the chances. I just, for some reason, I just never went for it. Then came back to England when I was 11, and then kind of went down other sporting routes. So I played a lot of rugby when I was younger. I was a quite competitive swimmer when I was younger as well, which took up a lot of my time. Did some boxing, but again, that didn't have time for it because rugby and swimming were my main thing. And essentially, by the time I'd got to university, martial arts was kind of out the window. But I was getting so injured in sports. So in rugby, my body was just completely battered. Like I couldn't, like I'd go 1-2 games and I was off. And I wouldn't get niggles. Like I'd get quite serious injuries. Like I'd blow up my ACL or I did my back, whatever. I never got niggles. Like I had quite serious injuries when I was sort of in my 20s, 30s. So I then moved to China. So back again, full circle, when I was early 20s. And essentially I wanted to keep going with rugby, but just I couldn't do it. And I pulled my back really badly on a gap year. And it just went from niggling, ongoing pain to just like full chronic pain. Like I just couldn't consistently get into any sports again. So the decision was, all right, now's my chance. I'm back in China. I can maybe sort of relive this childhood opportunity being in China, being the maybe adult version of the Karate Kid. And I thought, oh, well, I'm going to explore this. So I knew, though, that I couldn't really do anything striking. Like my knees were shot. Like I'd had, I think, 2 knee surgeries at the time. Like my back was bad, all these things. So I was like, right, I need to find something else. But I still have this like competitive, like almost that aggressive rugby drive to do something physical. And I just remember like this lingering thought at university. It wasn't at the time of, say, the UFC, but it was at the time when people could kind of download more of these sort of highlight reels of Wanderlei Silva and Rickson Gracie and like Royce Gracie and all that. And then I just thought, well, now I've got a bit more age on my hand. I kind of know that Kung Fu was pretty much not seen as the most effective martial art by this point. So I was like, well, I can't really punch or kick anybody. It makes sense to invest in something that's moderately like effective, supposedly. Like it seemed like that's what everyone was saying. It was the most effective thing to do. And you didn't, you could just possibly lie there for most of it. I thought, why not? So Googled some Ju-Jitsu and this kind of starts the whole thing to the trip later on, because obviously this is like 15 years ago. So Ju-Jitsu was tiny in China at the time, and I can go on to that, but yeah, like a small little gym. And that kind of set everything in motion. And then, rugby, all the rest of it sort of all went by the wayside, and Jiu-Jitsu became the focus thereafter. So yeah, that's the starting roots of this broken body in Jiu-Jitsu.
All right. So you had messed up knees and you thought, hey, Jiu-Jitsu, it's never had that effect on anyone. This would be a really safe option to try.
Pretty much. Yeah.
I guess at the time, probably no one, we didn't know as well as we do now how bad Jiu-Jitsu is for knees.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I didn't know. I mean, it was the thing though, like, to be honest with you, the worst thing at the time was my back. And that's where it was kind of Jiu-Jitsu. It was this love-hate thing when I started, because on one hand, like Jiu-Jitsu is great for your core, right? If you do it well. But on the other hand, if you do it badly, like, it really messes up your back, because, say you're playing guard, it's really hard, if you don't efficiently lift your legs and everything, you put so much strain in it. So it was so hard, because I would just start, I'm getting stronger. And then like I'd tweak, and then I'd be out again for months on end. So that's why my Jiu-Jitsu journey is kind of, well, not long in the sense that like my journey through it's been kind of long, because I've just had so many ins and outs of injuries, but that's been the fascinating thing as well, like trying to navigate that and find new opportunities, and like the traveling or training in different places and just a different style of training. Just I think from a very young age I had to adapt to injuries quite a lot, and I can't say I did a very good job for a long time, but I got got there in the end. I'm probably physically healthier now than I was actually in my 20s as a result of it. But yeah, as a base entry level jiu-jitsu, probably you've got to be a bit mindful. Yeah.
All right. So, I mean, carry on. Like, hell, you found a small one in China. You mentioned that you would bring up the fact that it's barely in China at the time, or
Yeah. So when I started, there was basically, I was in Shanghai. So there was one black belt in all of China, and he was in Beijing, American guy. And our gym was one blue belt from Australia, like an Australian Chinese guy. And it was just that classic. There was about 8 of us, maybe maximum per class. You know, jigsaw mats, some random room we'd hired, and that's it. Like, and having one of those really like a really passionate blue belt. He loved, like, I think he was an accountant, but just really wanted to train jiu-jitsu, teach jiu-jitsu, just gave everything to it. So even though we were like these white belts, didn't know anything, we actually had this amazing kind of little group of people, because we were also in China, we were overseas. Like, that's kind of the great thing about being an expat, is that you do kind of have these opportunities to like really dive into something, because you don't have the distractions in the same way as you might sort of elsewhere. So just a tiny little gym, and yeah, this one black belt in Beijing who was kind of affiliated to. He'd pop down and like give some stripes here and there. But yeah, it was fascinating to see how it evolved. So that gym, and this is not even, I guess it's 15 years now. So Stanley Tam, who's the blue belt, he's now like, I don't even know what he is now. He's like a 3rd degree black belt. And there's something like 10 affiliates of that gym in Shanghai alone.
Whoa.
Who's grown it?
It's grown. I mean, it is huge in China. So the 10 years that I was, I was training there. So I was training there for about 6 years, let's say. I mean, each one of those years, like we were moving gym like every other year. Gym's getting bigger. Another gym was open up in Shanghai. Another set of black belts. There was also a bit of a transition towards developing MMA in China as well. So then, because of that, they knew that they had to start bringing in some black belts, or at least higher level people, to come and train. So there would be black belts who you could bring in, but then black belts who these sort of training camps would, a bit like kind of in the Middle East, where they bring them over into like a fight camp, and they've just got like a resident base black belt. So all of that started around that period of time, and even for us, like, we'd have these you'd have these strange connections, and you'd have just these incredible people come and train with us. So, one of our guys who was there was a Half Gracie blue belt. Again, he's Half Gracie black belt now. And, one of his good friends, a guy called Tony Eduardo, really high level black belt, jiu-jitsu black belt, Hillian Gracie black belt, came to China, and I think he spent like 2 years with us, because it's like this random places, right? It's like, well, for them, it's a bit of an adventure, right? You come over here and suddenly you're in this room, there's like 10 of us, and you've got like a world-class black belt just hanging out, because they also don't have anything else to do with their time when they're there, right? They're just hanging out and wanting to be friends with you. So you've got like incredible training. And I think that's why some of these sort of random places in the world can have really good jiu-jitsu, because basically it's just people hanging out. And if you get a few good training partners and a few good coaches, like, that's infinitely higher access and opportunity than you will, like, being in Brighton with your 9-to-5 job. So yeah, it just grew rapidly. I actually looked the other day, there was a photo of me on this trip with, I think it was about 10 of us in my profile photo. And I think we're all purple belts then. But yeah, we all, like, in that photo besides Tony and Stan, yeah, we were all white belts how many years ago, and like basically I'm the only one who's brown. They're all black belts now. So, but it's ironic, right? Like that, just that shift now. I mean, there's like double-digit black belts within that one academy, and not only that, years ago it was literally Stan, this one little blue belt, trying to kind of promote the sport. So yeah, it's huge now, and there's so much more opportunity as well. I mean, it's massive growth, but actually so much more possibility.
Nice.
I had no idea that in China, jiu-jitsu has become pretty popular. I guess partly because China's a bit like, I don't really know much of what's going on in China. But yeah, that's pretty interesting. I would have thought that, I don't know, this is like obviously outsider view and ignorance to some extent, that it would be like suppressed to do anything other than like Chinese traditional martial arts. But it's good to see that that's not the case.
Yeah, but that was the case somewhat, though. What you just said.
Okay.
Yeah. So when it all kind of started to develop, well, I'll give you a couple of stories. So, for example, MMA started to get big around that time, and it was called Art of War. I think it was what their version was that they were trying to develop at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And they would get all sorts of trying to fighters in, and obviously a lot. They were trying to build up the Chinese brand, but also they knew they needed to get other fighters as well. So I'm pretty sure it was for this particular one. So like my coach, for example, was black belt, high level black belt. I think he'd started doing some MMA, but wanted to get into MMA. And I remember they basically said to him, if you come and fight on the show, like you can't take anyone down. Essentially, that was like the stipulation was like, no, no taking down, because they were also trying to build the brand of their own fighters, right? So of course their fighters were quite good strikers, but they didn't really have anything else. I mean, there's sort of other, obviously in China it's not just kung fu. There are variations, Sanda and stuff, but nothing comparable, right, to jiu-jitsu. So for him, yeah, they were like, no, that's the rule. Like you just can't do it. So in that sense, I think earlier on it was certainly suppressed. You also there was also quite a bit of that kind of almost not like how we think of it now, but those sort of challenges, right? Where you see kind of challenging a kung fu master and all, you see those online, and there were quite a few people who did take that up, kind of took it upon. There's actually quite a famous Chinese kind of whatever equivalent Instagrammer they are over there who's did some of that for years, like going around and basically challenging all these like kung fu masters and Tai Chi specialists, whatever it is. So there definitely was that. But also, like with time, of course, and things like the UFC, MMA in general, like it became quite obvious that, that needed to evolve. So if you think about, so I forgot the name of the guy, he's in the UFC. I know his nickname's like the Leech. He's yeah. So for example, like he was training, what's it, Jiang something? I don't remember his name.
Yeah, Jiang Ling, or I can't remember.
Yeah. So
we know who we're talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. So he was like coming through. So I actually competed at, for example, tournaments in China when he was there, when he was like a blue and purple belt.
Oh, no way.
So I'm assuming he's a black belt now, but like, it was like people like him started to like move, not just him, but it became obvious, right, that jiu-jitsu had to also become another element of this. And if they were going to actually expand their MMA fighting, for example, and like really develop potential champions, of which you're now seeing, right, like in the UFC, who are from Asia, from China, then of course you need to do this, and then like similarly flood in like black belts from around the world to come and train them. So you actually, like I said, you get some pretty high level and even relatively big name black belts who do go there to China. And I think there's even a UFC like training center in China now.
There's a UFC PI.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, so it was suppressed, but it didn't last long, I don't think. And because it wasn't really realistic, I think, if you're going to expand it. But yeah, I think initially, as you'd expect, it was, and I'm sure there's still a huge generation of people who haven't quite seen it for what it is yet. And, that's probably going to happen, right?
Sure.
So how did you, so you were in China for a while then, or what was the deal? You're there in your early 20s, you mentioned, but it sounds like you were there while it was growing up quite a lot.
Yeah. So I grew up there from 4 to 9. Then I was there from 22-ish till I was 31-ish. So I was there for about 9 years when I was in Shanghai, and then left Shanghai, when I was 31, 32, and then moved back to England. And that's since then has been when I've lived in England, like what was times I've physically been in England, but officially moved back to the UK. So that was like 8 years ago, post China. So the trip that you're referring to comes off the back of kind of all that period of time.
All right. Well, bring us on to it. I mean, tell us, it was an inspiration or what? Why did you do it?
Yeah. So I guess there's 3 reasons. So firstly, well, firstly was kind of the parallel reason for going. So this was like, well, I don't even remember when, 6 years ago I did this thing. So I come back to England. I did a master's degree. I wanted to do basically mix up. Like I'd worked in China, worked in the government sector for years. I kind of wanted to change something. And I was really interested in China-Middle East relations. So just to randomly jump again, when I was in China when I was a kid in 1989, which is when the Tiananmen Square protest riots took place. So I was there, so I was 6 years old or whatever I was. And I lived on a university campus. So I literally would go, I went into the square with like my babysitters were the students. So I like saw all this unfolding as a child. So yeah, there's a bit of a theme here that I find myself in quite random places throughout my life. So I basically I was there, obviously got emergency evacuated by the British government, all the rest of it. But like, I mean, there's a whole load of other stories part of that. But yeah, we lived there. And then essentially, when I left China, I wanted to go to the Middle East to sort of travel and experience it. Because I always felt like the Middle East was a part of the world that I didn't really know enough about. It's kind of that part of the world where it seems really, really relevant, but you never really have an opinion on it, right? So I was like, right, I want to go there. And I lived in China for 8-9 years, saved up quite a good amount of money. And I was like, right, chance to go there. So I flew into Egypt in January of 2011. And I don't know if you know, but January 2011 is when the Arab uprisings in the Middle East,
Arab Spring or whatever it was, right?
Started. So I literally flew into Cairo on a Thursday, and the Friday afternoon, which is after the Friday prayers, is when the protests in Cairo started. So I was there, like literally the next day, and we were staying like on one of the feeder roads to the main square. So like where all the army and police came down, where all the young students and everyone were like lining up. We literally like leaned out the window, like watching this entire thing unfold in front of us. And as you've seen, like up to this point, I'm quite adventurous. Like I like to, and I'm politically minded. Like I'm a sort of researcher, so I find that like fascinating. So like I was down there going around interviewing people, talking to them, trying to figure out what's going on. Like caught between tear gas, left, right, and center, and all the rest of it. I mean, I didn't understand what was happening, but like I'm really interested, and luckily I'd built up kind of a tolerance for uncomfortable situations.
Tear gas.
Yeah, quite early on. Yeah. It was so funny. Literally, we have like our swimming goggles. I was with my ex-girlfriend, so we had our swimming goggles. We were like leaning out the window, watching this whole thing unfold. Yeah, it was pretty nuts. So basically, I remember just standing there, looking around. Like, I mean, this is pretty epic scenes, and it just kind of made me go, "Wow, this kind of reminds me of China." Like, when I was 6 years old. So I just went, I wonder what the Chinese are thinking about this. And it just set in motion an interest I had for studying China and the Middle East. Because I had like a China background. I studied Chinese studies at school, at university, and I wanted to develop my academic knowledge. So I wanted to do Middle East studies. And I thought, well, don't just study in its isolation, like do it together. So the rest of that trip, needless to say, was quite hairy. So we like managed to get out of Egypt, got to Jordan, tried to get to Syria, and then basically had issues with visas to get into Syria. So we got turned back, and literally it was like days afterwards, Syria then kicked off, which was kind of sad as well, because basically we would have probably been like the last tourists per se that like would have gone to Syria at that point. Wow. And sadly, like we had good friends in Lebanon, and you have to go through Syria to get to Lebanon. So unfortunately didn't get to do that. And then said cut across, went through Palestine, flew out of Israel. So that trip kind of like really triggered something in my head, like, wow, there's this incredible part of the world that I'd love to learn more about. And there was a really interesting opportunity to learn about it, right? Because no one really studied China, Middle East. No one really had specialist skills in both those areas. So it kind of played on me for a while. And I had a couple of years left of a contract in China. So I went back, came back to England, did the master's, and then basically was thinking about just going back to work, but didn't want to go back to China. That was where all my biggest opportunities were, for like financially, professionally in China. I just didn't fancy it. And I really didn't want to do any more studying. That was my initial plan as well. But I kind of became open to the idea because I wasn't getting a lot of job opportunities in England. And essentially, long story short, like in the space of like a couple of weeks, I got offered full funding for a PhD in England. And the theme was basically broadly China, Middle East relations. So this was in January of 2016, where it was. So I would start in September. So I went, well, there's no point kind of getting some part-time work now. I've got some good money saving. I'm going to be funded from, whatever time. So like, why don't I just like use this time for a bit of an adventure? And as you kind of may have heard, like I love traveling. I love going to kind of more off beaten track places. I don't just like to travel. Like I like to experience things when I go to these places. And of course, like what I skipped before is like whenever I tend to go somewhere, I like to train there as well. And like just to experience it, like I said, I'm a researcher. I love speaking to people, learning their story, learning the politics, economics, social issues of those places. So I was like, well, I can go for, however many months I'd planned, 4 or 5 months, and essentially kind of get a sense, an actual geographical sense for what I'm studying, because I hadn't been to 95% of these places on China, Middle East studies. So I can go there, travel it. The Silk Road was like it was the China's Silk Road strategy, basically. That was the name tag, Silk Road. So okay, well, I'm just going to go and travel that, do some like really offhand research. But I mean, I'm going to be gone for like 4 or 5 months. I should still want to do some jiu-jitsu while I'm at this, right? So I was like, okay, right, I've got an idea here. So I'm like looking across the map, looking at the route I'm taking. Obviously, I'm fortunate. I've got contacts, across parts of China. I've got a couple of contacts in the Middle East. And I'm like, wow, like this could be an interesting little project, right? So quite, simply the idea, Silk Road Jiu-Jitsu kind of is the most natural thing that came out. And I was like, that sounds very obvious thing to call it, but that sounds really fucking cool.
Yeah.
Like, Silk Jiu-Jitsu, I like that. And yeah, it just started from there. I was like, okay, so that's it. Like I'm going to go, I've got this kind of vague route that I've got to take, and I'm going to try and train at as many jiu-jitsu gyms as I can along that route. As best as possible, try and document the thing. Obviously like a somewhat live documentation, but also film it. It was kind of at that time where things like, you get way more YouTube documentaries like Stuart Cooper, stuff like that was like, they were beginning to develop then. So I was like, oh, even though that's not my nature, like I was like, oh, I'd kind of like to maybe like you in podcasts. Like I just want to give it a go. It'd be fun, right? To just film. I don't want to just go and train at these places. So I'll get a camera and film it and interview like the instructors and maybe do like a technique from all of the instructors, all that sort of stuff. And that again links back to the whole early days of China, because like say the Stuart Cooper stuff, which is so amazing, but it's like all really famous people, right? Like, which we all love to watch, of course. But I'd been exposed for so many years to the people who weren't really famous, but were actually making a huge difference in the growth of jiu-jitsu. So like Stanley Tam, who you probably never heard of, right? Is the blue belt that taught me. Like I'd argue saying he's kind of the foundation of why jiu-jitsu is huge now in China, right? But you probably never heard of the guy, right? And these people have like incredible stories, right? And like they're so impassioned in what they're doing, and they're really going out of their way, right, to grow a sport when no one's really paying any attention. So that was also part of the inspiration. It's like because that's for me, like I'm interested in these people and like people that you don't see. So I was like, right, well, that'll be it as well. Like it gives me a chance to meet them, to maybe share their stories a bit, or like to just, give them a bit of exposure, right? And see the conditions under which they're doing their things. I knew it was happening in China, so it was bound to be happening, in Kazakhstan or Tajikistan or wherever else I was going to go. So that was sort of where it all triggered. And it's just, it's amazing because I always think about some corny stuff like, they talk about, dreams are things that happen, you do at night, kind of, all that kind of thing. Not when you're awake, but they're not the things that, you do asleep, but they're things that keep you up at night or whatever it is, those lines. And I remember just that night going, oh, this is an awesome idea. Like, this is going to be like, I couldn't stop thinking about it. And then like next day, knew someone in Hong Kong, wrote an email, and they're like, shit, this is amazing. Cool. Yeah. Come here first. And then like the whole thing just sort of snowballed from there. And within like, I don't even know, probably wasn't even a month, I was like, right, we're off. We're going to go do it. And I knew I couldn't track the whole thing. I knew it would have to kind of unfold, but I knew I had until September basically, right? So I was like, right, let's do it. And I had a couple places lined up first, and then it just went from there basically.
So how did you start it? Just boat over to France and fucking crack on, or what?
So I had some air miles left from all my years of traveling to China. So I knew I wanted to start in Hong Kong because I knew that Hong Kong, not well. So again, there's like an academic side, which is Hong Kong isn't traditional Silk Road, but like from the academic business cultural side, there's like it's relevant. But also Hong Kong is fascinating. Not that I ever lived there, but I'd go there a lot. Like there's loads of jiu-jitsu in Hong Kong as well. This tiny little place. So when we were like blue belt, one black belt in China, in Hong Kong, there were tons of black belts. There was loads of jiu-jitsu there, like huge amount of jiu-jitsu and really high level jiu-jitsu as well. So I thought, well, I'll go there and that will be like how it all begins. And I had a couple of friends down there already. So yeah, literally flew in, and yeah, on a very tight budget. And then we tell you more about what that looks like in a second. But yeah, flew in and then started and then worked my way up to kind of the east side of China, because that's kind of where all the major cities are. And then after about 3 weeks, then just started cutting across. So I think I took one flight, maybe 2 flights in the entire trip. Well, depending on certain geographic limitations, but all very short haul. Otherwise, it was buses, trains, and yeah, just went all the way across North China, through the 5 stans of Central Asia, so Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and then couldn't get into Iran, which was a real pity. And then so flew to Dubai, so this was in the UAE for a bit, Oman, then up to Jordan, and then again through Palestine, and out through Israel.
You didn't stop via Saudi for some jiu-jitsu?
Well, I would have. I'd love to have. The thing is, with most of those places, it's really hard to get in, basically, in terms of visas. Yeah. So, yeah, it's really like Iran and Saudi were particularly difficult. So I think
changed a lot in recent years, but I guess even 5 years ago, it would have been a bit of a mission.
Iran or Saudi?
Saudi. And well, actually, for that matter, I think both of them are on a bit of a, well, is it called public relations if it's just with the rest of the world? A global relations mission to not be the boogeymen.
Yeah. Well, Iran was such a pity, right? So on the Silk Road, you're basically, on average, everyone's going one way or the other. So you're meeting so many people in transition who've come from the places you're about to go to, vice versa. And obviously loads of people I met had come from Iran. And like, without doubt, and I swear that this is the truth, whenever you ask anyone on those routes, where was their highlight place they went to, where was the nicest people, the friendliest people, etc., Iran. That was always the answer. Everyone loved Iran. And if I remember, there was I think 2 options to get into Iran. So or maybe it was 1 at the time. If you went in, you had to have a minder the entire time. So you had to have your whole agenda set out, and you had to basically pay for a minder. So loads of people doing the Silk Road are cycling. So I met one guy on the way out, and he literally had to then hire a guy to drive behind him this entire route.
Oh my God.
Going through Iran, because he had to have a minder the whole time. But then there was another guy who I think he'd managed to not get my summit, but I remember him cycling up this hill, and everyone would talk about the incredible hospitality. And he was saying he was cycling up this hill, and this massive lorry behind him, and the lorry's pounding away on this horn. He finally gets to the top. He gives drops his bike down. It's like, what the fuck is it? Getting really furious. And the guy pulls up, gets out the truck, and it's like, you must be so hot and thirsty and hungry. Could I please prepare a meal for you? And the guy's like, sorry, what? It's like, this must be so difficult what you're doing. And yeah, literally this truck driver makes him a meal at the side of the road.
Incredible.
I just heard story after story of that. So yeah, it was so disappointing not to go there. And yeah, the plan was geographically, it all makes sense, right? Go through Iran, go through these other parts. But yeah, Saudi had a similar thing. I think unless you were going, for religious purposes, you then had to know someone there. I think you had to get the invite, and you had to be linked to. And I didn't have that at the time, so all of that just kind of made it way more difficult. But yeah, and then I then went to the UAE, and obviously the UAE, there was I mean, it still is, but that was where it really kind of, there was like 500 black belts or something crazy down there. So like, it made sense to go there, to be honest with you. So
Oh,
yeah,
what? Yeah,
what
Alex,
year
go on.
was that? That this happened?
26.
this was 2000 and I don't remember. I think it was 16. I think it was 16 I did it.
16. Okay.
Yeah, you said 6 years ago.
Yeah.
But
All right. So we still okay. So when you were doing this sort of, because I'm guessing in China you probably have a lot of contacts and you lived there before, so you kind of know how to find things, whatever. But then when it comes to the stance, how did you find jiu-jitsu gyms? And did you train in every stan?
Yeah. So I think that's the thing. Like once you get, it's like anything. Once you get in motion, things start making more sense, right? And once you're in one country, there's always someone who knows someone in the country next to it. Maybe not the country 2-3 places next to it, but there's always someone, right? And in China, loads of people from those stans, students particularly, are in China. So a lot of them are on funded scholarships to study there because there's all these relational kind of programs. And a lot of them also train jiu-jitsu in China. So there's again why like you get some pretty high level jiu-jitsu because you've got like these like dudes from Kazakhstan who are like some Greco-Roman champion or something, like training in Shanghai, for example, right? So that's what like saying standard is very high in these places. Once there's like that initial thing, which is okay, does anyone know anyone? Yeah, I know someone who knows someone, and then it's like that. And then you're doing the trip, and then you're beginning to get a bit of momentum because people see that you're actually doing the thing, right? So like, oh, great. And not that I did a good job by any means in terms of like documenting it per se, but I think given that these places, how they were quite small places, not in slightest on the map of jiu-jitsu, right? So for them, it was like, oh, this is amazing. Like some dude, they probably think I'm some like famous director or something, and I'm like some random dude. Like they go, oh, this is brilliant. Like, yeah, we'd love to host you. So, it was just literally a kind of a matter of next gym. Do you know anyone else who's at this place? Next gym. It just organically would happen that way. And in parallel, I was fortunate because I worked for the British government before this. I was always generally going to places where there was an embassy or a consulate. So I'd also like have a step ahead in that way. So like I'd talk to my colleague in Beijing, like, do you know anyone in, Almaty in Kazakhstan? He's like, yeah, I know. And then I'd have that. So I'd always have like these parallel tracks going at the same time. And of course I'd like Google that there was actually jiu-jitsu in these places that I was aiming for. Generally speaking, they had some crummy website or something. But that's it. It was really, really organic, which is kind of what the intention was as well, right? So,
where was the strangest place you went through?
So the strangest place, yeah. There's no jiu-jitsu involved, but Turkmenistan is without doubt the nuttiest place I went through in that trip.
I know a little bit about it.
Yeah. So depending, how much you do know, like it. So I think at the time, and I'm sure it hasn't changed much, there was 3, I think the top 3 most repressed countries in the world was North Korea, Eritrea, and Turkmenistan.
I believe it's now ranked number 2.
Okay, I didn't know which order it was, but I know it's in the top 3. So that was that. Like, everyone asks me a question like this, and it's kind of like in a good way, or are you just asking like a weird place over a good or a bad? So like, what's the highlight? I'm like, well, it's the highlight because I've never seen anything like it, and I probably won't anytime soon. So Turkmenistan was nuts. So again, a bit like these other parts, really hard to get a visa. And the only visas you could get were essentially on a tourist group, which I didn't want to do, or a transit visa. And its maximum was like 3 days or something like that. So it's designed that it has to track you, that you are in essentially constant motion towards leaving the country. Like you can't like go, I want to go here and then visit that. And like, no, you've literally got to map the route that you're going, right? So I managed to get this visa. I had like 3 days to get through this country. And like the minute I get there, like you're on some border in the middle of nowhere. Like the soldiers are all dodgy and corrupt, trying to get like money off you. You can't like haggle, a ride in anywhere. So you're like, again, you're being ripped off there. You got to this other town on the outskirts, this kind of middle of nowhere place. And then I have to get a night train into the main city. And basically, it's kind of like a bit of a summary of the rags to riches of when you travel. So I turned up at like 4 a.m. at this place. And again, I'd had a contact who was friends with the British ambassador of Turkmenistan. So he was like, well, I'll come pick you up from this hotel and we'll go for a coffee or something. So I found my way to a hotel, and he's like, right, well, you can't stay here. Like, this place is nuts. Like, we'll try and find you somewhere else. So we're driving around like Ashgabat, which is the capital, like nowhere to stay, or just hideously expensive for like some Soviet dormitory. And then he's like, look, just stay with me. So I went from basically staying in like crappy hostel to the ambassador's residence of Turkmenistan. So that made it slightly better. But in terms of more broadly, like Ashgabat is one of its informal titles is the heaviest. It's called like the heaviest city in the world. And the reason is because the city center is just basically all marble. Like,
Yes.
it's all these ministries of X this and ministries of complete rubbish, like, this kind of extravagant water fountains with, iron horses.
There's horses everywhere. It's the fucking horses, mate. Like that dictator is mad for them, and it's to a weird extent. Like he likes horses a weird amount.
Yeah, and I think like he'd renamed like the days of the week, to like his family members or something. Like he renamed he's done all this really quite extravagant stuff. And I had basically one day there to hang out. And so I woke up and I was like, right, well, I got one day. I'm flying to Dubai that night. So I was like, well, I'm going to go have a look around this. And, there's all these restrictions, like, be very careful where you are, not taking fit photos, cameras, da, da, da. I was like, okay, well, I kind of get a sense of it. But so I start the day, go to this little market, and they're like, no photos. Like, didn't tell you anywhere, but I'd Google this, said, just beware, you're not supposed to take photos of this market for some reason. And I was like, it's random. It's literally like a fruit market. So I went there. So I thought, well, I'll see what it's like, in these dictatorships, how it goes. So I literally took some pictures on the sly of some like watermelons. And within about 5 seconds, these two dudes, plainclothes dudes, rock up, arm over my shoulder. They're like, get your camera out. And like going through, they're like, you got to delete these photos now. They choose
holy shit.
Like, pieces of fruit is what I was. They're like, delete them, do them. I was like, right, well, people are watching, whether I realized or not. So I was like, okay, well, that's an entry to what's going on. So anyway, I continue this day I have in Turkmenistan. And then I go to the center where all this extravagance is. Keep in mind, like 99% of the country is in like absolute poverty, like no electricity, water half the time. But like you're in like this palatial center. But you can't really do anything because you can't take a photo of anything. You can't really walk down half the alleys. No one's walking around because it's so hot. And it's like not designed to be enjoyed, right? It's boiling there. So the streets are empty, all this marble everywhere. And then I'm getting lost. So I'm like, anyway, I've got my flight soon. So I find a bus to take me to the train station from where I kind of knew how I could maybe get back to the embassy. So I get to this train station, get off the bus. I'm like looking at my map, I'm like, okay, where am I exactly? And then I hear these police officers like whistle, call me over. And I'm like, oh, this is good. So like at least the police will know how to get me home. So they bring me into their office. They're like chatting to me. And I'm like, this is getting like pretty weird. And like kind of ask me questions like about political allegiances, interests, all this. I'm like, what the? I literally want to just get back to where I'm staying. So finally the guy's like, okay. So the policeman starts walking me out. And then he like sees this car, flags a car. And in Turkmenistan, as with a lot of those other countries, they don't really have taxi services. It's all kind of like weird, informal, flag a car. And if they want, they'll take you and you can pay them. So there's no taxis, essentially. So it's just cars. You really have to literally just get into a random car. So he's like, oh, it's fine. I'll get you back to your place. So he puts me in the back seat. He then gets in the front passenger seat. Someone else then gets in the other passenger seat. And I'm like, all right, what's going on here now? And they're talking. And so the first policeman has like this water cache. Sorry, no, the other way. It's the guy that gives the policeman a wad of cash. Then the guy behind me gets his phone out and he's like basically showing me numbers like $50, like to go to where I wanted to go. And I knew it was basically $1 I'd pay for. I was like, oh no, haha, just $1, $1, you know. And he's like, $50 to get. And I'm like, there's a policeman sitting right here, getting paid off. This guy's trying to extort money out of me, and we're just literally sitting at the local bus station. And I was just like, what have I got myself into in this moment? But long story short with that, I mean, it worked because I'm just like fiddling with the car, like having the door seat, kind of the car seat open, and in the end, just like, right, and then just like head out, boom, bolt out, and then like run down road, get into another dodgy car, obviously I don't know about either. And I'm like, is there any chance you could take me here for $1? Fly, go back there, get to the ambassador's residence. The ambassador's like, oh, how's your day been so far? I'm like, oh, wow, this is an interesting country that you've been sent to. So this is what's happened this morning. He's like, yeah, that shit unfortunately does happen quite a lot here. So literally then his driver then drives me to the airport, get on a flight to Dubai, flying to Dubai. And then my friend, who's quite successful lawyer at the time, she's like, yeah, stay with me. And then I'm out, I think at the end of the day, sitting poolside kind of at her fancy apartment building. I'm thinking, this last 24 hours, I mean, this is what happens when you do these trips. I'm like, literally like 8 hours ago, I was in the back of this car. Who knows what would happen? And now I'm sitting here in Dubai trying to get suntan, sitting by a pool. Right.
Before we get back to the jiu-jitsu stuff, why the hell did you go through Turkmenistan? Because you went through it, just got a flight out of there. Like, what the fuck? And why the fuck were you like, yeah, this seems like a reasonable place to go to get a flight? Like, is it a really mundane answer? Is it just like there was no airport in, like...
Yeah, there was. It was
it must have been, right? Like, what is it? Afghanistan and something else to border it?
What does border actually? Well, Afghanistan, I don't think Afghanistan, because Afghanistan borders beforehand. But I mean, to answer your question, I mean, it was like, as you can see, I like to go to random places, right? Yeah. So like, I saw the opportunity and I thought, well, if I'm here, then I'm going to try and do it. So, I mean, yeah, I could easily have not done it, but the whole point was to do these things. So, yeah, I mean, and I think there was a part of me, even though I think it's moved on now. Like I probably had a bit of an unhealthy fascination with like kind of adventure tourism, right? Which is sort of going to random places when random things are happening and the stories about them. I have a very different view on that all now, I think. But at the time, it's like, well, why wouldn't I try and go to this really random place? You know, the sad thing was I couldn't find any jiu-jitsu. That was the pity, because I did look, and I think there was some somewhere. But yeah, like as far as I was concerned, I wanted to, you know, put another adventure on it.
Yeah.
So,
How did you find the UAE? Because I'm never sure, like, well, I don't know. It's interesting that the country's kind of made its official sport Jiu-Jitsu. Like, that is the country's sport now. And as far as I can tell, it's just because the sheikh who made ADCC was like, I fucking love Jiu-Jitsu. Everyone else is going to do Jiu-Jitsu now. How did you find it there? Is it a different culture, or kind of what was the approach?
Yeah, it was interesting. So again, this is where like all this comes back to China, right? So I had a friend in China who was a purple belt when I first met him. And then he, really good competitor, got his black belt, and then was one of those 500 or so that, you know, get paid to go out there for, you know, year or two on contract. So I was like, awesome, like I'll go and stay with you, hang out with you. So I kind of got his perspective of it and his experience of it, and obviously bounced around a few of the gyms, because there's kind of like, there's the governmental side where the jiu-jitsu's in the schools, the militaries and the army and all the rest of it. And then there's also just the kind of it being a popular place for training as well. So I forgot the name of it. There's that big gym there, but it's more of a touristy place rather than it's actually like the government. So like a lot of these places, there's like the state, and then there's like the expat citizens, right? And obviously in places like Dubai or UAE, there's like tons of expats, right?
Yeah.
So they live in their own little world as well. But yeah, it was interesting. You know, I remember talking to some of those guys, and they flew in when they first went on these, their 2-year postings. And keep in mind, like most of these guys, like a lot of them haven't left Brazil before or wherever, right? And they're not necessarily that famous either. They're just black belts, basically, right? And they go and like, well, I'm going to go live in UAE for 2 years. I mean, like it's a kind of a bit of a random thing for them. But then to come in and then they're like driving to wherever they're being based at, and there's like billboards with, these local black belts, and they're like national heroes, and thinking, where on earth am I like taking this seriously, right? So yeah, it was fascinating. I mean, I never went to any of the actual like local projects when I was in the UAE, but what I did do is I'd kind of pop into some of the trainings of like the black belts training. So that was fascinating because my coach, the guy who I visited who was coaching, like he taught one set of classes, and then that same evening, like a whole, I don't know, there was like 40 of them, like black belts, then like descended into this like little gym because they're all bored, right? They got all this time, so they're going to train. And I'm still sitting there at that kind of time of life of like to see more than so and so many black belts was a big thing. Mm-hmm. And so 40 of them just like right in front of you and just rolling and sparring and doing their thing. And I'm like, what on? But that was it, right? Like that was the density that you'd have in those places. So yeah, it was pretty fascinating, and it was also kind of fascinating because you realize how unique it was, because we also went down to Oman for a long weekend because he got asked to teach a seminar down there. So let's go down to Oman, and it was like China. I think he was only a blue belt. He was a blue belt. He was the only like guy in Oman. And literally, we drove an hour back across the border, and there was 500 black belts in the UAE. I'm like, this is insanity, right? And he's like desperate to get it going there, and he's a black belt like on every street corner in the UAE. So yeah, it was pretty fascinating to kind of see that experience, and also just to see the lives that the people were building there, like the opportunities they had to like set up a gym or just be there or whatever it was, like a whole parallel universe of opportunity for these people. But at the same time, like I said, it's a bit random. Like you've got basically like 19-year-old, 20-year-old black belts who are like go over there to make money, and like I don't think they really know what's going on. They're like, right, I'm just going to teach and then leave. Like it's a bit of a weird setup in that sense. But yeah, it was incredible to see it.
What did you find about like Ju-Jitsu culture when you're traveling across? Because I've trained in. Well, actually, to be fair, I've trained in like Australia and the UK. And if I'm honest, the bit of Australia I went to, everyone was fucking British anyway, so it made no difference. But every gym I go to, it's a pretty similar culture. I know people talk about like, some gyms are really strict and some gyms are... No, every gym that I've been to, and bear in mind, I only just started training in 2015, every gym I've been to has been pretty chill. Like none of them are really strict about where you can and can't train. They've never made me bow to a picture of Helio or whatever in the corner.
Yeah.
Did you find it's similar Jiu-Jitsu cultures wherever you are, or does it vary a lot from country to country? What's more prevalent?
I think I bowed once to a poster in Hong Kong, I think it was. But thereafter,
was it Gracie Barra?
No, it wasn't actually. What was it? But it wasn't Gracie Barra. But I remember it specifically because my knees were so bad at the time. I was like, my issue wasn't bowing. My issue was the fact that I was kneeling at the front of the class for however long, and I was like, I can't take this on my legs. And then and obviously I've never been taught to bow, so I didn't even know how I was supposed to do the bow. But yeah, to get to your question. I mean, what would I say? Like, there's kind of two parts. So obviously, one part is me traveling through, right? So there's obviously a different dimension to how I was being received and how people were treating me. They're obviously so hospitable to me, really kind, really very respectful cultures. These places, probably too respectful. I don't think they realized I wasn't like actually much better than they were experiencing. I was generally getting my ass kicked by them all, and they all thought that I was being kind on them because I was a purple belt at the time, and you didn't really get like more than blue belts in a lot of those countries, right? So purple belt was like pretty big, and I wasn't even a particularly good purple belt, but I just happened to be a purple belt. And a lot of these gyms, like, like Kazakhstan, I still remember, like went in there, this huge, like kind of Soviet wrestling arena. And it's just that classic thing where they're like, oh, it's such an honor for you to be here and to drill this with us and da da da. And I'm looking around and these people are like smashing each other. And he's like, oh yeah, well, yes, sambo champion, judo, Kazakh, Olympic, all this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but they're all white belt jiu-jitsu. I'm like, no. I don't think it quite works like that.
There is some transferable skill there.
Yeah. So they'd like smash me and they'd be like, it was such a thank you for taking it easy on me. And I was like, yes. Yeah, for sure. Like, go home and cry in my pillow. Like, this is the most shaming thing I've ever. But no, I mean, incredible amount of respect. So for me, like, yeah, it was so kind of pleasurable to be in that environment. And I'd always kind of say like the uniqueness is obviously in all those places. I was always getting hosted. I was always getting taken out for dinner and all these things. And the truth is, all the conversations I realized after a while were always kind of the same conversations, though, right? They were like, "Oh, I love jiu-jitsu. What do you think about this? Oh, it's done this for me. Oh, who's your favorite?" Like, you realize that that's the same conversation basically everywhere you go, as long as you're within a group of people who are, generally pretty nice and friendly. And I was like, wow, like you realize again, this kind of classic thing of travel, we're all far more similar than we're different, right? And when we have a hobby that we're interested in, it really unites us. And like we kind of, not most of them spoke good English, but they weren't fluent. But we always kind of knew what we were going down, like that path of conversation, and that was always just so refreshing. In terms of like strict culture and stuff like that, not really. Like I think there's definitely like a lot of toughness in some of those gyms. Like certainly in the Stans, right? This is like former Soviet parts of the world. They're really tough, and you'll see people sparring, drilling, whatever, at really high like intensity. And it was always interesting because I'd go with my little camera and you'd film it. Of course, like, I mean, I'm sure you, even in the gym now, like if someone puts a camera on and you realize that you've fallen into their frame, you're going to like raise your game just a little bit, right? And you don't want to be the one caught on camera who's getting smashed. So I'd be filming and you would just see this intensity just like rocket through the room because they're thinking, all right, this is my shot. This is my shot to get on this guy's camera and I'll post videos. And it was always so funny because you'd see like someone getting smashed and you're like, whoa. And I'd give them like an extra 5 seconds just to like see if they could escape. And I was like, I can't film this all day. And I'd move on. And then I'd almost like look back at them and you could see like this deflated person, but I'm thinking, oh, this one chance I had to be on camera and I've just got beaten on TV. So that was always interesting. Like that intensity, I think, I don't think you find that. I haven't found that as much maybe in other places, maybe like say in England, but because a lot of those guys, they're so strong, they're really athletic, they have like this like background of combat sports, and they do it, and that's it. Like that's it. Like they're afterwards, there's no bad feelings. They're just like, that's how we train, basically.
Yep.
And you speak to them, their coaches, and they're like, yeah. Don't get me wrong. They will all get injured very badly at some point soon. This is not sustainable what they're doing, but that is just kind of what we do. So it was more like that, but no kind of like douchiness or anything per se. But like, yeah, like the men there saying definitely like, they had some honor in them. Like they weren't going to let you sort of run over them for no reason, kind of thing.
Yeah.
What was the what would you say was the most like, because we kind of did the crazy bit, but what was like, positively the most memorable part of the world that you went to train jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, the actual highlight.
Yeah.
Not just the
crazy
fucking
shit.
outlier.
So, I mean, I guess I'd probably say maybe two things. So one is just the more generic, like the highlight of just being able to have an experience like that off the back of doing jiu-jitsu, right? Just being able to go, I can do something really crazy and have people all over the world encourage it, support it, host it, you know, and I mean, that's just amazing. Like, you know, I didn't know 99.999% of the people that were part of this trip in the end, right? Yet they made it this incredible adventure for me, right? And as a result, not that this was the intention, the trip really wasn't that expensive because everyone was so hospitable to me. And, you know, it just shows like how if you're open to it, if you're open to engaging, you're open to talking to people, to doing something different, whatever it is, like people have your back. Like people want to help you do amazing things, right? They really do want to facilitate that. And so that's just been a huge lesson for me because it's like, wow, there's so much kindness to do this thing. And it was all kind of like, and not only that, but to do this thing that I love doing, which is jiu-jitsu. Like the fact that it was anchored in something that I love doing just like made it even more incredible, right? And then maybe like a more practical highlight. So before the trip, I had kind of bounced around, you know, like with other field work. And because my PhD, I studied Middle East, I moved around the Middle East, moved to Asia, here and there. And I used to, so one of the first places probably that I kind of experienced that like off the track training, let's say, like a different type of gym environment was the time I spent in Palestine, because a lot of my research was on China-Palestine relations. So I went there for like a few months before I started the trip, and I got to know the guys at the gym there really well. Again, like I think he was a brown belt then who was leading it. Really tough guys, really friendly people. And that was like my first thing of like, oh, wow, there's like this jiu-jitsu in these like really kind of places that you just wouldn't think, basically. And the incredible stories that come with that. And why that was fascinating to me is because that was then the end point of my trip as well. And so not only had I kind of gone about like, that's where it kind of triggered some of that interest in me. It was where I ended. And also I really love teaching jiu-jitsu, and it wasn't my intention to go and teach, but every once in a while I'd be asked, oh, you're here, do you want to teach us like your favorite technique or something? And I had I was having a really shitty day. Basically, I know what it was like. I lost my phone essentially in the last few days of the trip. And I had a really shitty day. And I remember the guy who's a coach there, who was really, really close to, and he was like, hey, do you want to like teach the class tonight? And this was literally going to be one of my last, I think it was actually my last session of the whole journey. And I was like, shit, yeah. And then the things I taught, I mean, it sounds so corny, but basically I taught a takedown that I remember being taught in China like years and years ago. I taught a choke that like, remember Yusuf had taught, right? Like bread cutter choke. I taught a pass that I learned in like, so there's a whole sequence. And I was like, wow, like this moment of like, I literally get like tingles, like thinking about it now. It's like, it all kind of came together in this moment that here I am having this experience, giving back what I'd drawn from all these places, doing something I love at this like point of where it all began. So I think that was a really kind of beautiful moment for me, sort of as I kind of came to the end of it.
That's pretty sick.
Yeah. Yep.
I don't want to round this out necessarily because I mean, I'm sure you've got like 1,000 stories. Are there any like key ones that you really wanted to talk about on this? Because we could keep asking you like, oh, what's this and that place, but like, are there any ones that you really want to mention?
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking earlier today about it, and it's less the Silk Road, but a story that I always find kind of interesting, going back to China for a moment, is because you're talking about how it was growing and expanding. So I remember it was one of the first like Art of War, like this MMA show, but like kind of wasn't the first Art of War, but it's the first one they really tried to do a big deal of. And I think they had some funding from like a sheikh, et cetera, and they flew over like an insane amount of basically top jiu-jitsu MMA fighters. So literally there was Hickson Gracie, Hoyler Gracie, Tim Sylvia, Damian Maya, John McCarthy, Tales Leites, Vitor Shaolin Ribeiro, and all these others. Baz Rutten was there, all right? All right? It was insane. I remember we went to this venue like to watch at the sports stadium, And like, I was like, what the hell I was like, how has this even happened? And this was like local, like, just local Chinese kids basically fighting. They'd flown these people over. And I was like, well, this is pretty cool. So the night starts with, I see Hicks and Gracie going down the tunnel of the stadium. So I'm like, everyone's trying to wave, get a picture. I think I'm literally white belt, so blue belt maybe. And I'm like, well, I'm getting a picture with Hickson. So I jump over the fence. I land next to Hickson. The minute I land, my jeans tear from like my waist to my knee. Like the entire thing just rips open. I'm like, well, hello, Hickson. Nice to meet you. And he's like looking down at me like man, what's going on? Like we had this moment of just silence where my underwear is just hanging out and my jeans torn to shreds. But anyway, we have a little catch up, and then he goes off on his way. And so we're like, right, well, we need to find the after party for this place. So we basically get the coordinates, and it's in some like lounge bar club. Don't know where it is, outskirts of Beijing. We turn up, and yeah, it's like pretty, like in any standard situation, it would be pretty dead, right? It was like pretty quiet place for considering what it was. So walk in, like, okay, cool. Like Baz Rutten, I think, is like smoking a joint or something like in the door. I'm like, oh, it's Baz Rutten just standing there, cool. Walk in, and then we're like, hi, Baz. Walk in, and it's pretty dead, basically. It's like a handful of people. But then you look around, and it was kind of like a bit like a blind date spot where basically all these celebrities, these fighters, have all clearly been like paid to be at the after party, right? But no one knows who they are, right? So no one, because at this point, they're all like random people. So you literally stood there in this bar, and like Hoyle Gracie was just like leaning against the bar on his own. Like 3 meters away from him, David Meyer was just like standing there. Then you had Tim Sylvia like sitting on a chair in the corner. And you had all these, but like no one was talking to them or doing it because no one knew who these people were. And like, to be honest with you, like a lot of them are kind of average Joe looking people. They're not like, besides Tim Sylvia, who's like, just like, I've never seen someone like that in my life. They're all just random people. And so we went in and like, okay, like, you start having a chat and like go first to Damien Meyer, like, hey, how you doing? And you're talking. And I don't know if you've met sort of spent time with celebrities, but after a period, it kind of gets awkward, right? Like you can't really be with them too long because it's like, no, this is strange. Like we're clearly not friends. We've done our like fake chat, and now I should move on. But they were so bored, all of these people, that they wouldn't leave it alone. So they were like, no, just keep talking. Like let's just hang out. No, I think we're good. We're going to just like go on our way. And then they'd be like, okay, bye. And then they'd just like lean back on their bench again, waiting for like the next person who obviously just would never show up. And I still remember like Tales later, I don't know if you remember him, he was a middleweight fighter. He fought Anderson Silva for the title. This is when Anderson Silva was like completely invincible. And he's like hanging out, like literally hanging out, dancing next to us. And I'm like, oh, Tales, and I'm thinking, like, I don't know, what do you say? I'm like, yeah, sorry about your last fight, like, yeah, Anderson, yeah, he's tough, right? Yeah, I mean, he gives everyone a hard time. Like, I'm talking to him as if I have any idea what the hell I'm talking about. And he's like, yeah, thank you for your, validation, young one. And I'm like, everyone, his striking is just really good. It's like, it's okay. Having these random chats. And then like Tim Sylvia like comes over. He's like disgustingly huge hands, like shakes hand, like mass handshake, talking to us, bitching about the UFC, slagging off Dana White. We're just standing there. This is the most surreal experience ever. And then he's like, yeah, he's got, as often seems to be the case, is this huge dude, and he's like with this tiny little Asian kind of girl that he's met. And I'm just thinking, right, this isn't going to end well, no matter what happens with this situation. And they go off into the night. I won't add any more to that. But in a weird way, that story kind of sums up these places. Like maybe less now, but at least when I was there, when. Yeah, like it's off the beaten track, right? Like all sorts of weird shit happen. Like famous Ju-Jitsu people, MMA people turn up, no one knows who they are, but they're in China, right? Or like you just find yourself in contexts that you just wouldn't find yourself in any other way, right? And I think nowadays it's maybe harder, but like you've got to go and find those adventures, right? Like they're out there, but they're not probably in Brighton anymore, right? But they are out there. And once you go on that path, like all sorts of crazy shit will happen. So yeah, that's always a story I think is kind of interesting for people.
Yeah, absolutely.
We hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please consider subscribing to the podcast and checking us out on YouTube, Facebook and Instagram under the name Combat Thoughts. We'll see you next time.